Arnold had some of the best Halloween specials in all of cartoons. I remember watching them as a kid and being genuinely creeped out, but at the same time, I couldn't look away. They were scary, but also so good that I end up watching them over and over again every spooky season. And even now as an adult, they still hit just as hard. What made Hey Arnold's Halloween special stand out was that they weren't your typical dress up and go trick-or-treating kind of episode. Not that those were bad episodes, but they were just predictable. But Hey Arnold went a completely different direction. Its spooky stories actually felt real. They had this eerie, urban legend vibe, like something that could have easily happened in your own neighborhood. Each episode typically started with someone in the neighborhood telling a scary ghost story, a creepy rumor, or some old piece of local folklore. And naturally, Arnold and his friends will set off to prove whether it's true. But what really made these episodes hit so different was the way that they pulled you into the adventure. It felt like you were right there with them, walking through the dark tunnels, hearing the creepy noises, and trying not to get too scared. Hey Arnold wasn't just a show that you watched. It was an experience that you felt. But out of all of the spooky Hey Arnold episodes, there was one that I could never forget. The one that absolutely terrified me as a kid, but somehow became a comfort to watch every single Halloween. I'm talking about season 1, episode 8, The Haunted Train. This wasn't just some silly ghost story. This episode had everything. An eerie legend, haunting visuals, creepy sound effects, and that unforgettable feeling that maybe the story wasn't as made up as it seemed. The episode starts off with Grandpa Phil getting ice cream for Arnold and Gerald from the Jolly Alley Man. Arnold and Gerald tell him that they're bored and feel like they've played every game that they can think of. Grandpa Phil tries to help them by asking them if they played checkers, and they hit him with a whole list of things that they already did that day. At this point, they're completely over it. That's when Grandpa Phil looks up and sees a train passing by, and you can literally see the idea forming in his head. He does a little smirk, and then he asks, "Did I ever tell you boys about the time that I worked at the train station?" Now at first, Arnold and Gerald are barely paying attention. They didn't even look up, but that was until Grandpa Phil says the magic words, "The train was haunted." And suddenly they're hooked. That single line changes everything. And honestly, that would have gotten my attention too. Grandpa Phil then launches into this scary story about the haunted train. He tells them that years ago, there was a train conductor who completely went mad and drove his train right off the tracks. Supposedly, everyone in the town saw this happen. People ran after the train, tried to flag it down, but the train just kept going, faster and faster, until it finally disappeared into the night. And no one saw the train or the conductor again. But of course, Grandpa Phil doesn't stop there. He adds that some people said that the mad conductor actually drove that train straight to the fiery underworld itself. And every year on the anniversary of the crash, you can still see the same train, with the same mad conductor roaring back into town to pick up unsuspecting passengers. He then explains that these poor passengers don't even realize what's happening because they're drawn in by a bright, hypnotic light, and it pulls them right onto the train. And once they step inside, the horror begins. Grandpa Phil says that the first thing they notice is the smell. This awful stench of rotten eggs filling the air. Then comes the noise, a loud shriek echoing through the tunnels. And honestly, the way that Grandpa Phil tells it, with that dramatic voice and creepy energy, I was so scared hearing this as a kid. It's like you could feel the tension building. It was definitely one of those ghost stories that started to feel a little too believable. He then ends the story by saying that the last thing that the passengers ever see are the flames of the underworld itself. And then they're greeted by the red hot demon. And just when you think that he's done with his story, Grandpa Phil hits them and everyone else gathered around with one last twist. He casually mentions that tonight happens to be the 40th anniversary of that crash. Then, in classic Grandpa Phil fashion, he says, "I sure wouldn't want to be at that train station tonight." And obviously, that's all it takes to plant that idea into the kids' heads. And you just know that Arnold, Gerald, and the other kids are definitely gonna go check it out for themselves. Once Grandpa Phil leaves, Arnold asks Gerald if he thinks that the story that he told is actually true, because he knows that his grandpa sometimes stretched the truth. This prompts Helga to jump into the conversation, saying that she needs some type of proof that Arnold's grandpa is actually telling the truth. Helga then tells Arnold and Gerald that she's going to the train station tonight, and if they're not chicken, they should go too. So Helga, Arnold, and Gerald go to the train station that night, and it looks so creepy. It's dark, ran down, and full of spider webs and bats. Honestly, that would have been my cue to just leave, but they continue to go through with their plan. And after waiting for some time, the train finally shows up, and they see a bright white light, and they walk on, just like Grandpa Phil described. Then, all of a sudden, the train starts to smell like rotten eggs, just like Grandpa Phil said it would. And that's when the panic really starts to set in. The kids start looking around, realizing that every single thing that Grandpa mentioned in his story is actually happening. You can see it click for them. This isn't just some spooky made-up story anymore. It's real life. And then of course, Helga completely loses it. She starts pleading for her life, screaming to the top of her lungs, and honestly, that would have been me if I was there. Then out of nowhere, there's this creepy looming shadow that starts moving behind Helga. The lighting, the music, everything makes it feel like this is it. Like this is the moment that the red demon appears. The tension is high and everyone is freaking out. And then the shadow steps into the light. And of course it's Brainy. He just randomly showed up with no explanation. It's so random and Helga even throws him off the moving train. Then the train screeches to a stop. The kids all freeze and the door slowly creaks open. And that's when they see it. the flames. The fiery glow that Grandpa described. It's the final confirmation that they needed. In their minds, this is it. Grandpa Phil was telling the truth. They've officially arrived to the underworld. But instead of letting the fire consume them, Arnold, being the quick thinker that he is, grabs a fire hose and sprays it right at the shadowy figure standing in front of the flames. And when the water clears, they realize that the terrifying figure isn't a demon at all. It's a steel mill worker, because the haunted train didn't take them to the underworld. It took them straight to the steel mill. That's when everything starts to make sense. The rotten egg smell wasn't the scent of hellfire. It was the sulfur from the mill. And the flickering light that drew them into the train was just the old train lights. Every creepy little detail from Grandpa Phil's story was connected to something completely normal. It was all just exaggerated through the kids' imagination and fear. Grandpa Phil eventually shows up and picks the kids up from the train station, and Arnold is clearly upset. He tells his grandpa that he shouldn't have made up that story. And for a moment, it feels like the classic lesson learned ending, like everything was going back to normal. But then, just when you think that it's over and the episode is going to end on a relieving note, Grandpa Phil smirks and tells Arnold that the story wasn't a lie. And then the camera pans out, the eerie music starts up again, and we see it. The ghostly haunted train racing down the tracks with the mad conductor singing that haunting song. This was honestly the scariest Hey Arnold episode to me. I'm the type of person that if I watch something scary, I need to know that it was all just a story made up or that there was some type of logical explanation. And for a while, this episode gave me that. When everything turned out to be the steel mill, I remember feeling so relieved, just like Arnold and the other kids. But then Grandpa Phil tells Arnold that the story wasn't made up, and the camera pans out to show the ghost train. That terrified me as a kid. This is one of those episodes that you have to immediately put on My Little Pony or something when it ends, just to wash away all the scary thoughts. But as much as this episode scared me, I love it because the fact that it's so scary is what makes it so good. It builds up this creepy story, makes you think that it was all a misunderstanding, and then hits you with that one last scare right before it ends. It's the perfect mix of mystery, fear, and storytelling. And even now, as an adult, I can still appreciate how well the writers did that. Out of all of the spooky Hey Arnold episodes, I think this one is my favorite. And what makes it even better is that when you really think about it, this episode isn't just about a haunted train. There's actually a lot more going on beneath the surface, and in the way that each character behaves. And there's symbolism even down to the haunted train itself. The haunted train itself represents belief. Once it starts moving, it's almost impossible to stop. Just like a rumor or a story that takes on a life of its own. The more people feed into it, the faster it goes. And before long, it's no longer about what's real or fake. It becomes something bigger. Something that people feel is true even if they can't prove it. And that's exactly what happens in this episode. Grandpa Phil tells a story that starts out to be a bit of fun. But once Arnold, Gerald, and Helga start to believe it, that belief transforms everything around them. Suddenly, every noise, the flickers of the light, and every shadow becomes proof in their eyes that the haunted train is real. It shows how powerful belief can be when imagination takes the wheel. The bright light that lures the kids onto the train symbolizes curiosity. That irresistible pull that we all feel towards the things that scares us most. It's the same feeling that makes you peek through your fingers while watching a scary movie. Even when we know something will frighten us, we still want to see it for ourselves. Arnold, Gerald, and Helga could have went home, but instead they decided to follow the light. It's the perfect metaphor for child curiosity. How it leads us into unknown places where we learn, grow, and sometimes get terrified in the process. Then there's the rotten egg smell and the flames. On the surface, it's just the sulfur and the heat from the steel mill. But through the kids' imagination, it becomes the horrifying scent of hellfire, the gateway to the underworld. It's such a smart detail because it shows how powerful the mind can be when it's running off of fear. What's normal in the daylight becomes unrecognizable in the dark. Kind of like when you see a pile of laundry in the corner of your room and you mistake it for a monster. This moment in this episode captures how fear distorts our perception, and how easily the mind can transform something completely harmless into a nightmare when we start believing the worst. And finally, the fact that the haunted train returns every year on the anniversary of the crash is also symbolic. It represents the cycle of stories and fear. That tales never truly die. They get retold, reshaped, and passed down from generation to generation, like a ghost that refuses to rest. Every time someone hears a story and believes it, the train comes back to life over and over again. In a way, the haunted train isn't just a ghost story within a show. It's a reflection of how legends and fears live within all of us. Grandpa Phil is a storyteller of this episode. He's a spark that sets the whole adventure in motion. In a lot of ways, he can be seen as the puppeteer. He doesn't tell the story that scares the kids just for his own amusement, but he tells it because he knows exactly what they need. Arnold and Gerald were bored out of their minds. And Grandpa Phil, being who he is, knows that sometimes a good story, even a spooky one, is the best cure for boredom. Grandpa Phil represents the older generation passing down tales to the next, not just to entertain, but to connect. These kinds of stories are how he keeps a bit of magic and mystery alive in a world that sometimes feels too ordinary. Through him, this episode shows how storytelling is its own kind of legacy. It's how adults remind kids that imagination isn't something you outgrow. Every ghost story, every legend, every back in my day tale has its own purpose. It keeps curiosity alive. When Grandpa Phil ends the episode with that sly little grin and says, "I never said that the story was made up," it's more than just a punchline. It's his way of keeping that spark alive a little longer. It's that gentle reminder that maybe there's still some mystery left in the world. That line ties into the bigger truth that even adults carry their own beliefs, superstitions, and pieces of wonder. Grandpa Phil symbolizes the role that adults play in shaping how kids see the world through their imagination. He reminds Arnold and his friends that the world is only as dull or exciting as you make it. And even though his story led them into a terrifying situation, it also gave them a memory that they'll never forget. It turned an ordinary night into something special. And that's exactly what childhood should be made of. Arnold has always been the balance between wonder and logical thought. He's curious but rational. He's the kind of kid that wants to believe in the unbelievable, but only if he can see it for himself. And that's what makes him such a great character, especially in this episode. While everyone else gets caught up in the fear or excitement of Grandpa's ghost tale, Arnold is the one who is curious, but still questions whether or not it's true. When he agrees to go to the train with Gerald and Helga, it's not because he's trying to show off or chase danger. It's simply because he wants to know if the story is true. And that's what separates him from many of the other cartoon protagonists. Arnold is brave, but his bravery comes from thoughtfulness and not impulsiveness. And symbolically, Arnold represents the balance between belief and reason. He's the rational believer, the kind of person who believes just enough to explore, but still keeps one foot grounded in reality. He's the middle ground between Gerald's caution and Helga's boldness. In a way, he represents a lot of us who questions things instead of outright believing everything they hear. When the train finally arrives, Arnold's reaction shows exactly who he is. Even though he's scared, he doesn't run away. He steps forward. His choice to confront the train, instead of hiding from it, symbolizes courage in the face of the unknown. That willingness to look your fears in the eyes and find out what's really behind them. And when he discovers that the train isn't actually haunted, but instead just leads to the steel mill, you can see how disappointed he was. That moment represents the universal childhood moment when you realize adults don't always tell the truth. When the magic of the story fades and reality takes place. Arnold's frustration at the end of the episode is completely understandable. Because for him, the story wasn't just about ghosts. It was about believing in something mysterious. But then Grandpa Phil gives him that final wink and says that maybe it wasn't made up after all. And that's when Arnold's expression softened. And that's the beauty of it. Because right there, he rediscovers his sense of wonder. It's like he realizes that truth and mystery can coexist. That maybe the world doesn't have to be one or the other. Logical or magical. It can be both. Gerald is the voice of reason in this episode. He's the grounded friend who can sense the things that might go wrong. He doesn't want to go to the train station, and honestly, who can blame him? But he does end up going, and not because he necessarily believes in ghosts, but because he wants to support Arnold's curiosity. Gerald represents the rational side of childhood. That inner voice that tells you that something might be a bad idea right before you do it anyway. He's the kind of friend that's cautious and overthinks a little, but still tags along because he doesn't want his friends to go through anything alone. That balance between fear and loyalty is what makes him such a relatable character. Symbolically, Gerald is the bridge between the story and the audience. He reacts how many of us would in this situation. Skeptical, uneasy, constantly questioning what's happening, but still too curious to turn back. Through him, we feel the tension more deeply because he grounds the story in reality. When Gerald's anxious, we're anxious. His nervous energy reminds us that the ghost story could actually happen. And that's what makes that supernatural moment hit harder. Gerald also brings an emotional honesty to the group. While Arnold's trying to make sense of things, and Helga's putting on a brave front, Gerald isn't afraid to admit that he's terrified. He's not trying to prove anything, he's just being real. And that authentic behavior keeps the tone of the episode believable. It's what makes the scary parts feel less like a cartoon, and more like something that could have happened to us as kids. Gerald's the reminder that fear isn't weakness, but instinct. And yet, even though he's scared, he still goes along with Arnold anyway. And that makes his role even more important because it shows that sometimes courage doesn't look like being fearless, but instead, it looks like being terrified but still showing up anyway. Helga is one of the most expressive characters in this episode, and her reactions have so much symbolism and meaning. On the surface, she's the loudest and the toughest. She's the one that mocks Grandpa Phil's story and dares everyone to go to the train station with her. She wants everyone to think that she's fearless. But this episode peels back her mask and shows us what's really underneath. She's scared. And her fear reveals how human she is. And it's honestly one of the most relatable parts of this episode. Helga's tough exterior symbolizes the armor that some people put on to protect themselves from fear or even emotional pain. Her mockery of Grandpa Phil's story isn't just humor, but a defense mechanism. She's trying to convince herself and everyone else that there's nothing to be scared of. But later in the episode, when the fear becomes real, her armor cracks. She's screaming, panicking, and honestly, it's beautiful storytelling because it shows the raw vulnerability that she usually hides. Even the moments that's meant to play as comic relief, like when she throws Brainy off the train, carry symbolic weight. It's her embarrassment, frustration, and need to regain control when reality doesn't match the tough persona that she's projecting. In that moment, she's not just reacting to what she thought was a ghost. She's reacting to her own vulnerability being exposed. It's like she's running from more than just a shadow. She's running from the truth of her own emotions. And that tension between her outward toughness and inner fear is what makes her one of the most layered and relatable characters of this episode. At first glance, Brainy might just seem like a random joke. the silent, awkward kid who shows up out of nowhere. But in the context of this episode, his eerie, sudden appearance actually fits perfectly into the deeper meaning of the story. On the surface, he's just there, shadowy, mysterious, and completely unexplained, like a ghost slipping into the frame. No lines, no explanation, just eerie breathing behind Helga, adding a subtle layer of tension. Symbolically, Brainy represents the fear that always lingers behind you, the kind of anxiety that you can't quite name or explain. His sudden appearance mirrors how fear can creep up on you at the worst possible moment. And when Helga throws him off the train, it's more than just comic relief. It symbolizes the human instinct to reject or push away what we don't understand, to defend ourselves against things that unsettle us, even if they aren't truly dangerous. That moment is funny, but it also resonates with how a lot of us handle fear. Brainy's presence also interacts with the other characters' reactions in subtle ways. He heightens Helga's panic, underscores Arnold's curiosity, and amplifies Gerald's nervousness. And in a sense, he's like the embodiment of lingering tension, the part of fear that exists even when you think you've understood everything that's happening. Hey Arnold's Halloween episodes were really experiences that stuck with us long after we turned off the TV. And The Haunted Train is the perfect example of that. It's spooky, funny, nostalgic, and still makes us question if Grandpa Phil was telling the truth the whole time. This episode captures that perfect middle ground between childhood imagination and real fear. It reminds you of a time in your own life when stories like this felt possible, when the line between make-believe and reality was blurry enough to make you look over your shoulder at night. And that's why this episode still holds up today. So whether you're watching it for nostalgia or just for a good Halloween scare, The Haunted Train will always have that same haunting charm that makes Hey Arnold Halloween specials one of a kind.